Live on national TV, Jasmine Crockett challenges Mitch McConnell, and the truth detonates. She unveils his broken oath, his scheme to block Garland, and the betrayal that reshaped America's courts. The Senate chamber shakes the crowd, roars, and the world watches. Will McConnell's empire finally crumble tonight? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The U.S. Capitol hearing room blazed under harsh white lights. Every senator's seat was filled. Reporters packed tight laptops, open recorders flashing red. The air was heavy, thick with tension, ready to snap. Something was about to erupt. At the center sat Jasmine Crockett, young, fearless, her eyes burning with focus. In front of her lay a thick file bound by a red string, tight like a bomb waiting to detonate. Across from her sat Mitch McConnell, 80 years old, posture, rigid hands veined and steady, the weight of 3 decades of power resting in his stare. The topic was integrity, the sacred oath to protect the Constitution, the very promise McConnell now stood accused of betraying. Then the chairman's gavel struck bang, bang, bang. The sound cut through the silence. All eyes turned to Jasmine and McConnell. No one moved. No one breathed. A political explosion was seconds away. The gavel's echo still hung in the air when Jasmine Crockett leaned toward the microphone. Her tone was calm, but the sharpness in her eyes cut through the silence. "Mr. McConnell," she began, her voice steady, "do you remember the oath you took in 1985? The question sliced through the tension like a blade. McConnell's brow lifted slightly. "Of course," he replied, his gravelly voice carrying across the chamber. "I swore allegiance to the Constitution." Cameras zoomed in. Jasmine reached into her folder and pulled out a yellow document. Her voice rang clear and firm, "to protect the voting rights of every citizen." The sound of clicking keyboards stopped. The entire room seemed to lean in, waiting for what came next. She didn't pause. "Then why did you block Judge Merrick Garland's nomination in 2016, she asked. "You said the people should choose the next president before a new justice was appointed." Garland, she reminded the room, had been President Obama's pick for the Supreme Court, a moderate, respected, and widely praised judge who never got a hearing because McConnell refused to allow one. A ripple of murmurs moved through the senators' row. McConnell's lips thinned. "That was the Senate's right," he said, voice tightening. "I followed the law." Jasmine's expression didn't change, and yet she pressed in. 2020, just days before the election, you rushed to confirm Judge Amy Coney Barrett, the very opposite of what you claimed 4 years earlier. Barrett, she continued, was President Trump's nominee, pushed through at record speed after Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. The contrast was stark, undeniable. The room vibrated with whispers. Even staffers exchanged nervous glances. McConnell drew a deep breath, his knuckles tightening around the edge of the desk. "This is politics, Congresswoman," he said sharply. The context was different. His words hung heavy, but Jasmine didn't blink. Her tone cut through the air like ice. "The context changed," she said slowly, "but the Constitution did not." The sentence hit like a gavel of its own. Then, without another word, Jasmine reached for a small black remote. A giant screen flickered to life behind her. The first clip showed McConnell in 2016, his voice booming, "The American people must choose the president before we fill the Supreme Court seat." The next clip, 2020, showed the same man, older, colder. "There's no reason to delay this nomination." The contradiction was stunning. The chamber gasped. Reporters shot up from their seats. Phones recorded the moment that would dominate every network within the hour. Chaos broke loose. Someone in the back shouted, "Shame." The word echoed again and again, swelling into a chant. McConnell slammed his hand on the table. "That was a different context," he roared, his composure cracking. "You don't understand." His voice filled the hall, raw and furious. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her words came calm, precise, unrelenting. "The context may change," she said, "but the Constitution does not. You betrayed your own word, Senator, and you betrayed your oath." The hearing room went still again, every eye locked on McConnell. And in that silence, everyone knew the storm had only just begun. The chaos from the last exchange was still fading when McConnell leaned toward the microphone, his jaw tight, his tone rising higher than usual. "Ms. Crockett," he said, voice trembling with controlled fury, "you have no right to stand here and judge me. I've defended this nation through multiple presidents while you've barely set foot in Congress. His words echoed against the marble walls, sharp and personal. The senators shifted in their seats. Reporters froze fingers, hovering over keyboards, waiting for what would come next. He pressed on, his voice hardening. Tradition, he declared. Stability. The power of the majority. Each word landed heavy like a hammer. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't even blink. She let him talk, let his anger fill the room until it began to suffocate him. McConnell's face flushed red, his hand gripping the desk so tight the veins stood out. Then came the strike. You, he spat, only seek the spotlight. You don't understand that politics is the art of compromise. He pushed himself up from his chair, towering, his hands shaking as he pointed straight at her. I did what history will remember as defending America, he growled, voice cracking with rage, and you're just chasing the camera's light. Jasmine sat still for a moment, the faintest smile curving her lips. When she finally spoke, her tone was soft, but every word hit like steel. You're mistaken, she said calmly. That same camera will record this moment, Mitch McConnell betraying his own oath. For a heartbeat, silence ruled the room. Then whispers swept across the chamber, reporters typing furiously. A few nodded, realizing they'd just captured the line of the decade. The tension hung thick, and everyone knew this hearing had crossed a line it could never return from. The air was still charged from McConnell's outburst when Jasmine rose slowly from her seat. She didn't speak at first. The silence made her movement heavier, deliberate. Then, without a word, she reached down and pulled out a new folder. Its cover was red, the color of warning, the color of consequence. She placed it on the desk, untied the string, and held it up for everyone to see. Since you care about facts, Senator, she said evenly, let's look at the record. Her hand pressed a button. The giant screen behind her flickered to life. A chart appeared, bold white letters on black. 13 votes, each one tied to McConnell's name. 13 times he voted against bills expanding voting rights. Jasmine pointed at the first entry. In 2013, you voted against the Voting Rights Amendment Act, the very law meant to restore protections after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. The photo beside it appeared protesters outside polling stations holding signs reading, "Let us vote." Jasmine's voice sharpened. You called it unnecessary oversight. She turned to the next slide. In 2021, you voted against the Freedom to Vote Act, claiming it was a partisan power grab. The image flashed a line of elderly voters in Georgia, waiting hours under the sun. A few gasps rose from the audience. Jasmine continued, her voice cutting deeper. And again in 2022, you blocked the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, named after a man who nearly died for this right. You said it gave too much control to Washington. Each statistic landed like a blow. 13 red bars filled the screen like open wounds. The room erupted. Democratic senators slammed their hands on the table. A few shouted, "Shame!" From the gallery, a woman cried out, "That's our history you destroyed." The sound swelled murmurs, turning to shouts, flashes bursting as reporters captured every frame. McConnell's face darkened. He pushed back his chair and stood abruptly, his voice booming across the chamber. I followed the law, he barked, his hand slicing the air. I acted on principle, not emotion. Jasmine didn't flinch. She took a step forward, her voice steady but cutting. No, she said, her words crisp as glass breaking. You acted on power. Your oath lost its meaning the moment it became convenient to ignore it. The tension was suffocating now. McConnell's chest heaved. He leaned toward the mic, his voice rising, breaking apart. I didn't betray anything, he shouted. I held this Senate together when everyone else was weak. His face flushed, crimson beads of sweat shining under the blinding lights. Then a slip. The microphones caught the sound before he realized what he'd done. McConnell muttered under his breath, voice hoarse and bitter. This is all a damn show. The words bled into the speakers, amplified across the hall. The room froze. Every camera swung toward him. Reporters' eyes widened. The audience erupted again, half in shock, half in outrage. Jasmine stood motionless, her gaze locked on him. For the first time, the weight of his words didn't just hang in the air, it burned there. And everyone watching knew this wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. The last echoes of McConnell's outburst still trembled in the air when the chairman's gavel came down hard. Bang, bang, bang. Order, he shouted. The chaos fell into uneasy silence. But the quiet wasn't peace, it was pressure. the kind that makes the air feel too thick to breathe. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Senators stared at one another wide-eyed. No one dared to move. McConnell exhaled shakily, his voice rough and tired when he finally spoke. "I have served this nation for over 30 years," he said, gripping the edge of the desk. "I have never turned my back on the Constitution." The words came heavy, almost pleading. His shoulders sagged under their own weight. Jasmine said nothing. She crossed her arms, eyes fixed on him, calm and unflinching, letting him bury himself with every word. The cameras panned to the audience. A middle-aged woman in the back row began to cry softly, whispering, "We believed in you." Beside her, a veteran in uniform shook his head and muttered, "He's not the same man." The silence that followed felt louder than any shout of verdict without a judge, a courtroom without mercy. The silence still pressed on the room when Jasmine drew a steady breath, the kind that resets a battlefield. She set a small black USB on the table, the plastic glinting under the lights like a sealed fuse waiting for heat. Her voice was plain, unshaken, carried cleanly by the room mics. "I have here a 2016 recording from a closed-door meeting between you and your donors." A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery, then died back into fear as staffers froze and pens hovered. She slid the drive toward the clerk, nodded once, and took the remote with a surgeon's calm. The clerk connected the device. Jasmine pressed the button, and the red tally lamps on the cameras seemed to burn brighter. Speakers in the paneled walls crackled to life, and a familiar baritone poured out, unmistakable, even through the static, the cadence precise and unhurried. "We will never let Garland set foot on the court. If we do, we lose power for a generation. You have the money, I have the votes. Fair trade." The words rolled over the desk like a slow detonation, rising with each clause, gathering force as staffers exchanged startled looks. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze, every breath suspended on the last two words, as if the building itself were listening. Then a reporter's voice ripped the silence. "He just admitted it." Cameras burst like lightning, and the gallery surged to its feet, the shock turning into sound, a wave that hit the dais full on. McConnell lurched forward, fury sparking in his eyes as he stabbed a finger at the speakers. "This is fabricated deepfake technology." He roared, the veins in his neck standing out. His chair scraped backward, the sound harsh, but Jasmine did not move. She kept one hand on the table, steady as stone. Her answer was quiet and exact. The recording was authenticated by forensic experts, and the metadata shows it was made on March 18, 2016, inside your office. She let the line hang so the words could settle on every seat, every camera, every notepad. This was not an old paper file to parse or spin. This was living sound, a piece of time that would not lie. He gripped the microphone with both hands until his knuckles blanched, and the tiny tremor in his fingers shivered the metal ring. Up close, the cameras found sweat beating at his temple, and the shadow gathering behind his eyes. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out, too soft to shape into denial, too late to pull the words back into his throat. Across the room, even the partisans stopped shouting, the shock turning into a heavy, watchful quiet. Somewhere a pencil rolled and hit the floor, the small click echoing like a verdict. Jasmine stayed standing, eyes level, as the audio hummed in the speakers, like a clock that had just struck the hour, and no one dared to look away, not even him. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to make the room feel smaller. Every breath seemed too loud. McConnell's hand still gripped the microphone, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His voice came out uneven, cracking slightly under the weight of what had just happened. "You don't understand the pressure," he said, eyes fixed on the table. "I did what I did because I believed it was the only way to protect this country." The words hung between them, part defense, part confession. No one spoke. Even the reporter stopped typing. Jasmine took a slow step forward, her heels echoing through the quiet. She stopped right across from him, close enough for the cameras to frame them both in one shot, power and accountability, face to face. Her voice was firm, each word deliberate. "No," she said clearly, "you did it to protect your own power. And pressure is never an excuse to betray the Constitution." The statement landed like a gavel strike. McConnell blinked hard, his composure cracking again. Around them, the air felt like it was holding its breath. Then Jasmine's tone softened, the steel giving way to something deeply human. A voter from Texas called me when she said, turning slightly toward the cameras. A black woman crying because she was turned away at the polls. She asked me, "Is there anyone left who keeps their oath for us?" Jasmine's voice wavered just slightly, not weakness, but truth breaking through. And today she continued, "I can finally answer her yes." The room was still. The sound of quiet sniffles rippled through the audience. Even the clicking of cameras slowed. McConnell lowered his head. His shoulders sagged, his grip on the microphone loosened. The man who had commanded the Senate for decades now looked small beneath the lights. For the first time all day, he had no words left. He didn't even try. Jasmine stood beside him, motionless, the silence between them saying everything that still needed to be said. Then with a deep breath, she turned toward the main camera broadcasting live across the country. Her eyes were steady, her voice unwavering. "An oath," she said, "isn't meant to be read. It's meant to be kept." The words echoed through the chamber like a bell tolling the end of an era. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then from the back rows, a single clap broke the stillness. Another followed, and then more. Within seconds, the sound swelled applause rolling across the hearing room like waves breaking against stone. What had begun as a confrontation had become something larger, a reckoning, and the entire nation was watching it unfold. The sound of applause was still echoing when the tension broke like a crack of thunder. Senators from both parties leaned across their desks, whispering urgently. Some looked stunned, others furious. The hearing had slipped out of anyone's control, no longer a political performance, but something raw and irreversible. A centrist senator, pale and shaken, pushed back his chair and rose. His voice trembled, but it carried through the chamber. "This is no longer politics," he declared. "This is a betrayal of the oath sworn before the American people." The room went dead quiet again, not because people disagreed, but because they all knew he was right. Then came the chaos. Reporters bolted from their seats, sprinting for the exits. Phones lit up, cameras turned to the hallway. Within seconds, screens across the Capitol flashed the first breaking banners. Crockett exposes leaked recording. McConnell betrayed Garland. The headlines spread like fire. Producers in every newsroom shouted for live feeds. Anchors interrupted programming mid-sentence. "We're cutting now to Capitol Hill, a stunning revelation just moments ago." The nation's pulse quickened. The shock wave had left the room and was now tearing through the country. Back inside, McConnell rose slowly, his face drained of color. The authority that had defined him for decades was gone. His hands fumbled for his glasses as he reached for his papers, but there was no order left to collect. He straightened, adjusted his tie, and began the long walk toward the exit. Each step echoed against the marble floor, heavy, final, like the sound of a monument cracking. Staffers parted to make way, but no one spoke. Even his allies avoided his eyes. The microphone, still live, caught a faint voice as he removed his glasses. Politics, he muttered under his breath, was never about oaths. The words quiet as they were carried through every speaker broadcast into the ears of millions watching live. For a split second, no one processed it. Then gasps erupted. The line, bitter, cynical, and damning, was already being clipped, replayed, and transcribed in real time. By the time McConnell disappeared behind the doors, the phrase had exploded across the internet. Hashtags surged: Oathgate, broken oath, keep the oath. News anchors repeated the line in disbelief. Pundits dissected it frame by frame, tone by tone. Within minutes, major outlets had split-screen footage, Jasmine standing tall beneath the lights, McConnell's silhouette shrinking into shadow. The contrast was cinematic, the symbolism unmissable. On Capitol Hill, the political earthquake began. The Democratic caucus seized the moment like a spark in dry grass. "This is the time," one senator declared outside the chamber. "We can't talk about accountability without reform." By afternoon, the party leadership had announced a push for Supreme Court reform proposals to limit judicial terms and strengthen ethical oversight. For the first time in decades, the idea didn't sound radical. It sounded inevitable. Cameras caught Jasmine's allies huddling in quiet conversations, drafting outlines of what would soon be known as the Judicial Integrity Act. But across the aisle, the fracture lines deepened. Inside the Republican conference, voices clashed in hallways and elevators. Loyalists called the hearing a witch hunt, but moderates weren't buying it. "He crossed a line," one senator was overheard saying. "He traded integrity for control." Conservative commentators, usually protective of McConnell, began to turn. On social media, one headline trended for hours: from kingmaker to liability, the fall of Mitch McConnell. Party donors started asking questions. The sense of invincibility that had once surrounded him was gone. Outside the Capitol, the world was already reacting. Thousands of protesters gathered on the steps carrying hand-painted signs that read, "Keep the oath and justice for Garland." Their chants rose into the cold evening air, echoing through Constitution Avenue. Television networks broadcast the scene's live, crowds wrapped in flags, students waving copies of the Constitution, veterans in uniform standing silently with candles. A young woman on a megaphone shouted, "We're not here for parties, we're here for promises," the crowd roared back. As night fell, Washington turned into a city of noise and light. Drone shots from news helicopters showed the Capitol dome glowing above the masses, chants rolling like thunder. Commentators on every major network compared the moment to Watergate, some calling it even more consequential. "This isn't about burglary," one historian said on air. "This is about faith, the faith that oaths mean something in a democracy." The phrase "Oathgate" stuck, immediately coined by a headline editor at the Washington Post before midnight and picked up by every outlet by morning. Back in the hearing room, the cleanup had already begun. Chairs pushed back, microphones switched off, papers gathered in silence. But the image that would stay burned into America's memory wasn't McConnell's walkout or the shouting crowd. It was the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped down from the dais. She gathered her notes, straightened her jacket, and walked toward the exit. The cameras followed her every step. As she pushed through the heavy doors, the sound that greeted her wasn't silence, it was applause. Outside, hundreds of supporters were waiting, their cheers breaking through the marble halls. "Jasmine, Jasmine," they shouted, phones raised high. She didn't wave, didn't pose. She simply nodded, once her face steady under the blinding flashes. The footage ran live across every network that night, her silhouette framed by the bright corridor lights. Her stride unwavering, her expression calm amid chaos. For millions watching, it felt like the closing scene of a political thriller, but it wasn't fiction. It was history in motion. The next generation had found its symbol, and the old guard had just written its final line. The video replayed across every screen, from cable news to TikTok reels, under a single caption that spread faster than any speech could: Jasmine Crockett, the woman who kept the oath. The ovation that trailed Jasmine into the corridor bled into the morning broadcast, and by sunrise, the country had decided what it had just witnessed. The labels hardened first, faster than press releases or polls. Mitch McConnell, once the Senate's master strategist, was recast in a single phrase whispered on trains and shouted in comment threads: "The oath betrayer." Clips looped of his face under the white-hot lights as the recording played, cut against his own past statements, like a confession he could never retract. The story left the hearing room and settled in the bloodstream of the nation. Editorial cartoons arrived by noon, savage and simple, a quill drawing of a man sawing through the word oath while clutching a gavel. Donors who once prized his steadiness began to speak in careful past tense, praising decades of service while distancing themselves from the last 24 hours. Cable panels stopped calling him a tactician and started calling him a case study. The phrase "oath betrayer" moved from Chiron to headline to shorthand, a verdict without appeal. It wasn't just about one vote anymore. It was about what an oath means when power's on the line. And while his image collapsed, Jasmine's did the opposite, rising with a velocity that felt less like celebrity and more like clarity snapping into focus. She didn't grandstand, didn't chase another camera. She let the footage speak, and the silence after it carry the weight. Across the country, anchors began to introduce her with a new honorific: the keeper of the oath. Not a slogan, not a brand, an assignment. It hung on her like a badge forged in public fire. Parents replayed the hearing that night, telling their kids, "Watch the moment where she doesn't yell, she just holds the line." A clip of Jasmine's face, calm, unblinking, unafraid, became the still frame that teachers dropped into civics slides. Her sentence: "An oath isn't meant to be read, it's meant to be kept," crawled across billboards bought by small donations, the kind that leave ink on fingers and pride in chests. She was not merely victorious, she was instructive. In the span of a day, she had turned accountability into something visible. Then the professors arrived, the historians, the constitutional scholars, dragging footnotes into prime time. Invitations multiplied and converged into a decision. A joint conference convened by law schools and history departments streamed to packed rooms and overflow halls. They called the event what everyone else had begun to call it, the betrayed oath hearing. Paper titles read like warnings: oath as institution power, as temptation precedent, as alibi. For once, theory followed practice instead of the other way around. In lecture halls from Boston to Berkeley, the panelists did what panelists do. They argued about context doctrine, Senate norms, and the geometry of power. And yet every debate kept bending back to the same fulcrum: the recording, the words, the plainness of the exchange. This one historian said into a hot mic, tapping the transcript is not a policy disagreement. This is a moral failure with procedural fingerprints. First years in the back row stopped scrolling and started taking notes. The hearing ceased to be just an episode. It became a chapter. Libraries began drafting archives the way curators draft exhibitions. They built a digital shelf labeled The Betrayed Oath Hearing, preserving every transcript clip and caption while the pixels were still warm. A law review announced a special symposium. A history quarterly promised an oral history series. The National Archives requested the USB copy and the remote not as artifacts of scandal, but as artifacts of instruction. The names in the index stood next to big cases and bigger wars. Far from campus, the language filtered into living rooms and locker rooms and late shifts. High school coaches told teams, an oath is your playbook. You don't change it at halftime because the score hurts. Pastors rewrote sermons. Union stewards updated pledges. Swearing-in ceremonies found a new line for the end: keep the oath. The phrase moved like a drum line you can hear 3 streets away, steady, unignorable, exact. Culture adopted it not because it rhymed, but because it fit. In McConnell's world, the lights dimmed to a kind of dusk that never turned to night or morning, only hallway. A camera followed him once, then twice, then always a long lens catching a figure that seemed smaller with every step. He became an image before he became an explanation. Shoulders hunched high, loosened a man walking past portraits of predecessors who never had to hear the word betrayal attached to their names on the evening news. If he spoke, the sound rarely traveled beyond a murmured no comment. The frame itself was the statement. Meanwhile, the frame around Jasmine did the opposite. It widened. She walked toward lights instead of away from them, not to bask, but to be seen in the exactness that made the moment real. The crowd met her before the microphones could a tide holding paper signs as if they were lanterns. Keep the oath rolled over the marble and into the cold air, a chant that felt less like protest and more like a pledge. You could trace the sound from rotunda to sidewalk, from Capitol steps to kitchen sinks watching at home. Editors cut split-screen montages. They didn't even need to caption the shadowed corridor on the left, the floodlit press spray on the right. Left a silhouette thinning at the edges, swallowed by the building that once amplified his voice. Write a leader, squared to the lenses, letting 3 words from the crowd answer the question of what comes next. The contrast taught the lesson without a narrator. Every cutaway was a civics class. Back at the university, syllabi changed in real time. Week 1, founding oaths. Week 9, the betrayed oath hearing. Professors who had once assigned Federalist Papers in Marbury now added timestamps from a modern hearing, asking students to map the gap between promise and practice. Panels closed with a single question, written on whiteboards. What is an oath worth when it costs you? Students stared longer than they wrote, which was the point. Not everything a class teaches is a grade. In newspapers that still printed ink on weekends, essays arrived like letters to the future. Veterans wrote about their hands shaking when they saluted, for the first time the weight of words that make a person heavier in the best way. Nurses wrote about promises whispered during night rounds, the quiet oaths that never trend. A judge name withheld wrote, "We don't keep the republic by loving power. We keep it by keeping our word." The line circled back into classrooms and hashtags and dinner tables. None of it would have mattered if the image at the center had been false, if the sound had wavered, if the moment had felt contrived. It mattered because it looked like what it was, a reckoning conducted in the daylight of a lens that did not blink. McConnell's fall wasn't a spectacle, it was a mirror. Jasmine's rise wasn't a coronation, it was a reminder. The hearing made abstractions visible. And so the legacy fixed itself in two scenes that every network aired until they became a nation's shorthand. First, the corridor, Mitch McConnell moving through shadowed the camera, losing him to darkness until only a gaunt silhouette remained. The hallway swallowed his outline, the way a tide takes a broken mast, slow, indifferent, complete. No music under it, no commentator over it, just footsteps and the weight of what they carried away. Second, the threshold, Jasmine Crockett, stepping into a wall of cameras and microphone flags, her face lit not by spectacle but by the simple fact of being seen. Around her, the chant rose on cue without being cued. Keep the oath, a sound that shook the glass in the doors and rattled the frames on the walls. She did not lift her hands for quiet. She let the words crest and recede like truth finding its level. When the anchors finally went quiet and the credits rolled on a day the country would replay for years, there was one line left to say. She faced the main lens, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the steadiness that had made the moment possible. Her voice didn't rise. It settled the way a verdict settles when a juror signs their name. Democracy cannot survive on betrayed oaths. The sentence hung there complete, and the screen faded to black. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.